Good morning, and welcome to the 37th Annual Frank Church Conference on How Democracies Survive and Thrive in the 21st Century, sponsored by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. My name is Garry Wenske, and I am the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute in the School of Public Service. The Institute was established to honor the achievements and to carry forward the principles of Senator Frank Church. He delivered the first lecture on War or Peace, the American Role at Boise State University in 1982. Given today's challenges to democracies around the world, conversations like these are even more important. On behalf of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, our thanks to Oppenheimer Companies, C. Frederick Cornforth, and Community Development, Inc. for underwriting this series on Fridays with Frank. Thanks also to Gregory Caslow and Kay Hardy, and to Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer for sponsoring today's conference. This morning's panel will address the topic, Hungary, a case study in democracy, with Chase Johnson as the moderator. Chase is a political consultant and former research assistant at the Frank Church Institute. Previously, he held internships with the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and with the NATO Policy Office at the Pentagon. He is a member of the Board of Directors of the Frank Church Institute. Welcome to the panel, and let's begin with Chase.
And welcome everybody to our morning panel on Hungary. And we'll begin our discussion of how democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century with perhaps the strongest case of democratic backsliding in the Western world. When Hungary transitioned to democracy in the late 20th century, it was a model of the post-communist world. It had a thriving pluralist system, and it quickly ascended membership in NATO and the European Union. In some ways, many of these realities are still true for Hungary. But for the last 10 years, it has been led by Viktor Orban, who proudly declared in 2018, the era of liberal democracy is over. And he meant this as a good thing. Unfortunately, Hungary is now seen as a textbook example of democratic backsliding in Europe. Orban loyalists have slowly taken over almost every media outlet in the country. Hungary also literally built a wall on its southern border. Ruling elites have a very fluid concept of the rule of law, and they burnt bridges with major institutions. Unfortunately, the list of undemocratic behavior is too long for my short introduction today. So let's meet our excellent panel and we will get the conversation going. They both have extensive resumes, but I'll try and give you some highlights. Ambassador András Simonyi was Hungary's first ambassador to NATO and later ambassador to the United States. He presently is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of the memoir, Rocking Towards a Free World, When the Stratocaster Beat the Kalashnikov. I was formerly András's research assistant at Johns Hopkins University, and I can confirm personally that he really does shred on guitar. Melissa Hooper is the Director of Foreign Policy Advocacy at Human Rights First. She is a graduate of UC Berkeley's School of Law and has a distinguished career researching and advocating for rule of law and human rights around the world. Some of her recent writing has focused on how the global pandemic has opened the door for authoritarians to further entrench their anti-democratic ideas, including in Hungary. So we will hear briefly from our panelists to get us started, and then we will open up the floor for discussion and questions. I'll remind our audience members, if you have questions, you can type them at the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will get to as many as possible. So Melissa, let's begin with you, and thank you all for joining us this morning.
Great, thank you. Okay, hello. It gives me a little bit of maybe amusement to hear that the title of the panel involves Hungary and the word democracy, because I think as Central and Eastern Europe watchers, that there are a lot of us that have been doing some hand wringing over the past many years, the past 5, 7, 10 years, about whether Hungary is still a democracy and is it becoming an autocracy. And I think we have finally decided we're there. We have gotten to a point where we have autocratic rule in a country in the EU. Orbán and Fidesz have undermined and hollowed out and even attacked democratic institutions and risked regional and their own security to cozy up to dictators like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. So I will do just a quick overview of why I think that's true, why we're seeing what we're seeing, and why that counters the idea of Hungary as a democracy. Maybe talk a little bit about consequences, and then turn it over to Ambassador Shimone for even more discussion of those consequences, and we can talk about where we're going from there. So I think I'll start with the last election, with elections being one of the stellar sanctuaries or institutions of democracy. In the last election in April, presidential election in April 2018, Fidesz won a supermajority while gaining barely 50% of the vote. And that was because of laws and changes to the electoral laws that allowed it to do so. The OSCE criticized that election, noting that the Fidesz party was able to use state funds for its campaign and use state media, whereas the opposition was completely barred from doing so. Also in April, I will say in terms of power grabbing after the onset of the pandemic, you saw Orbán and the Fidesz supermajority pass a emergency powers law that gave Orbán power to rule by decree, essentially as a dictator. There was a lot of outcry around that law. It eventually was repealed, but an emergency powers law remains. The state of danger is declared, and so there is still additional power given to the executive. And this is a pattern that we've seen over many years. And even after that, just last week, we saw some constitutional amendments introduced. They have not passed yet. However, they are again very likely to do so. And they again limit the power of opposition parties to be able to run in elections in Hungary. So we're seeing the strangling of the opportunity of opposition to even gain a foothold. And then because of the consolidation of power, if they are able to ever gain some foothold in government, they just won't be able to change the laws. They won't have the supermajority required. Talking about media, Chase mentioned independent media, and I would say that free media outside of Budapest is pretty much non-existent in Hungary, and it's becoming more and more closer to extinction in the capital. Fidesz has consolidated media outside the capital through nefarious deals and schemes and pressure, so that friends of Orbán, such as Lawrence Mészáros and Orbán Habani, have taken over a lot of those media outlets and then consolidated them, almost 500 of them, into one big super foundation that was then gifted to the government. So the government now controls media outside of the capital. And if you look at the cover pages of the news, all of the regional newspapers, they look exactly the same. This is now continuing inside the capital. This year, during the pandemic, we saw in July that the largest independent media outlet, Index, was shut down. And then right after that, the second largest media outlet, 24.hu, the owner, Zoltán Varga, is stating that he is getting pressure to sell to a Fidesz associate and is trying not to, but he's getting a lot of pressure. And in September, we saw the last independent radio station's application for its license denied by the media authority. And so after February 2021, it's very likely we won't see an independent radio station in Hungary anymore. When we talk about checks and balances, I mentioned the limitations that have been placed. You know, what has essentially happened is that when Fidesz came to power, they expanded the definition of cardinal laws such that many laws require a supermajority to change. They also rewrote the Constitution and consolidated executive power. So this is a pattern that we've seen since 2010 and has continued to just last week. When we talk about the judiciary, what Fidesz did toward the beginning of its rule was push out those judges it disagreed with on the Constitutional Court and then replace them with its loyalists. There was a court ruling that said that that was not properly done. It was illegal. However, the ruling came several years after this had happened, the European Court of Human Rights ruling. And so the response was Hungary paid some fees and paid back wages to the judges, but the replacements had already been made, so there couldn't be any changes. More recently, you saw a Fidesz associate put in charge of the National Judicial Council that selects and appoints judges. And when the Court of Justice of the European Union very quickly said that she had too much power and that this appointment and her exercise of power violated EU law, the Hungarian government just said, we disagree. We are going to go with Hungarian law. And so now they're flouting the rulings of the Court of Justice of the EU. Which is, I think, a very serious exercise of pushing away of the EU. In addition to attacking its own democratic institutions, we've seen the Hungarian government risk regional security and its own security while kicking out one of the top US accredited institutions in Europe. This is the Central European University, and kicking it out for essentially no reason. When it complied with all the hoops that it was required to jump through, still Orban refused to permit the university to stay, kicked it out, and instead has now brought in a new university from China. Fudan University has just opened up, is opening up its campus there. Hungary also hosts the largest facility, Huawei facility outside of China. And this is even after Secretary Pompeo had a very frank conversation with Hungarian leadership and outlined the risks. And we know this because Orban then went to China and told the Huawei leaders that he had no concerns with what Secretary Pompeo said and wanted to deepen the relationship. We see Orban doing Putin's bidding, essentially taking Russian propaganda, translating it into Hungarian and putting it out within Hungary. Blocking Ukraine from negotiating with NATO and inviting the International Investment Bank, a Moscow-controlled bank, to open its branch or to transfer its leadership from headquarters from Moscow to Budapest. And that essentially gives the Kremlin a foothold within the EU and NATO, where it may conduct intelligence operations. And also, I think it provides some resources, some financial resources to Orban and his friends for some of their schemes. And if you want to talk about corruption, we also see Fidesz welcoming in Russian corruption, whether it's allowing Russia the contract to refurbish the Budapest metro, or giving Rosatom, a Russian state-owned company, the contract to expand the Paks nuclear plant. So the EU has been slow to respond. We can talk about the conditionality of the budget, which they're trying to do right now. But when the EU has responded, we have seen Hungary, again, not going to follow your EU edicts, and this has been very problematic. But the US has also not been, the US administration has not helped. We have seen the Trump administration grant Orban White House visits, even as he is destroying his own democratic institutions. And considering weapons deals, even as, for example, Norway has tried to hold back some of those deals in order to try to get some funding to NGOs and try to increase relationships with and functioning of these institutions. And so I hope that we will see some changes as we move forward. You know, we need to, hopefully, we'll see a Biden administration wanting to work more with the EU to increase support. But I think we're definitely at a dire situation in Hungary when we're talking about democracy. And we really need to start brainstorming because the trajectory has been going on for a long time. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Let's hear from Ambassador Simonyi now.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you, Chase, for inviting me. Thank you all for for joining this this event. And sure, I wish we were working together still. That was fun. And I really appreciate you doing you doing this. Melissa's summary was excellent. So there are a lot of things I really don't have to say, and I really want to avoid repetitions because with the clarifications from Melissa, I think you all understand what the situation is. So what I'd like to do is more directed in a direction of, okay, so is Viktor Orban winning? Why would America, why should America worry about a country nobody has heard of, and most Americans wouldn't be able to find it on the map? And I think this is really the issue we have to talk about. Why is it that Hungary has become the centerpiece of the debate about the future of democracy, not just in Hungary but in general? And I think this is the issue I'd like to discuss a little bit. Having said that, I'd also like to add some of my thoughts to why I think this situation, why are we where we are? Well, first of all, I was totally wrong. I've known Viktor Orban since 1988. I really thought of him as an excellent and very interesting, bold young man. And I'm not saying we never had a friendship, but we did have this cordial relationship, and there were times when we talked a lot. And my impression was that this was a totally okay guy, very smart, and I always thought he would become the leader of Hungary one day, and he would, lead the country towards modernization and towards the West. And I was totally wrong. And so this is one thing. The second thing is, I was also wrong about the EU and NATO being membership in the EU and NATO would be enough guarantees to prevent an eventual backsliding. I did see these dangers already in 1990, 1991. I definitely had this impression that this is going to be our conversion, our turning into a full-fledged democracy is going to be a longer project. I never thought it would be as easy as many in the West and as many of the liberal friends in Hungary thought. Building institutions clearly was not enough to build a strong and lasting democracy. On the contrary, where we were totally mistaken is that once these institutions are established, if you don't safeguard them, if you don't fill this with content, if you don't have the guarantees that you will maintain a level playing field for critical voices and opposition at all times for a long time to come, then there is a danger of backsliding. And nobody wanted to listen. They all said, you're nuts, you're crazy. But I was wrong. I was wrong only to the extent not detecting the dangers early enough, but I was totally wrong in terms of how solid the support of institutions like NATO and the European would be to guarantee this level playing field, to prevent a Hungarian backsliding, to prevent an eventual authoritarian personality to rise and then take the country in the wrong direction. Now, I do believe that one of the reasons Hungary slid into this situation is because the complacency of the West in the 90s. The West was totally complacent about winning the Cold War and about and I hate to say this because I love Fukuyama. I really thought Frank is one of the great thinkers. And I don't want to repeat what you've all heard about the end of history as we know it. But the fact is that we all thought that history would take a big turn, and now it would be now the whole world is moving towards a liberal democratic kind of a society. And we were all wrong. Now, where did this actually go wrong? Well, first of all, and I'll stop and I'll have to answer the question why I think this is so important, why it is so important that Americans deal with Hungary. It is because I have always likened the Hungarian situation the last 8 years to cancer that starts with a small cell. You don't see it. It's a little dot. It's a little spot on your skin. You don't worry about it. Your wife tells you you'll be fine, baby. Don't worry. We don't have to spend all that money on the dermatologist to get it fixed. By the time you go to the dermatologist, by the time he sends you through the system to figure out what's wrong, you're dying. And that's really my verdict. Nobody wanted to understand when I started saying this 8 years ago. People say, oh, you're nuts. You don't like Viktor Orban. It's not true. It's not true. I was his ambassador to NATO. Don't forget this. I was the ambassador who stood next to him when he raised the flag at NATO headquarters when Hungary became a member. I was the one who was his closest assistant when we fought a war in Kosovo. So I know the guy. I also know that he would have been totally capable of doing totally the opposite of what he is doing. What is the reason why did he turn? Well, first of all, I think he's always felt like an outsider in the West. And I think early on, he has decided to take a revenge on the West when they started looking down on him. He's a newcomer, he's a nobody. Well, I'm going to show you. This is one. The second is corruption. We all underestimate, and Melissa, thank you for explaining this. We all underestimated the role of corruption and money in creating authoritarian regimes. It's not just about power. It's the combination of power and money, or maybe the reverse, money and power. I'd also want to add that we never understood, we always talk about the lessons learned from the past. And I don't, people say this, but I don't think they believe this. They never look at the past. If you study the history of the Soviet Union, if you study the history of, and namely Stalinism, if you study the history of the Third Reich, if you study the way these systems came to be, and the way the dictators solidified their rule, there are a lot of lessons to be learned. It didn't happen overnight, and it did happen with the complacency of democratic and liberal thinking people. So please don't tell me that you've learned your lesson, because you haven't. Now let me come to and then I just want to say a very few things, because I'd rather much rather have a conversation. One is the dismantling of the institutions and overtaking institutions, and the dismantling of checks and balances is a slow process. And it happened under our eyes, and nothing was done. The European Union did almost nothing in the last 10 years to stop this. And now look where we are. Now there's this little country, and basically I have to say that it's like when the little dog is leading the big dog. It's Hungary leading this whole fight. It's not the Poles. Don't tell me the Poles are the same. They're not the same. And it's ridiculous that people are linking the two together. It's stupid. It's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. this tiny little Chihuahua is leading the Saint Bernard and making it crazy. This is something Europe did never realize. Finally, I'd like to say that no, I don't think this is done. I don't think this is irreversible. But it will be to think that a democratic election bringing the opposition to power in itself will be a solution. And Melissa, thank you for saying this. I think we've reached the point of no return where a simple election will not be enough to reverse the course of this, because they have occupied the courts, they have occupied the legislature, they have occupied the free media, and they have also totally occupied the executive. So taking back just one of these is not going to be enough to fix the country. A final comment I'd like to make. I really think this should be a bipartisan issue for the United States. I think we have a better chance with Biden to fix this, but it's got to be a bipartisan issue. Just the other day, John Bolton, as someone who I worked with, I have a slightly more sophisticated view of John than most people. John gave an interview and said, just because of the friendship between Viktor Orban and Donald Trump, you shouldn't think that we did not have a lot of issues with the Hungarians. And it's not just their friendship with China and Russia, but also the whole issue of backsliding democracy. And it's got to be a Republican-Democrat issue. So when we talk about this and when we rejoice that it's okay, it's a new situation, I think it is important to remind ourselves that this has got to be a joint Republican-Democrat issue. Only then will it be possible for the United States and Europe to hold hands to help fix this problem, which in my understanding goes way beyond just Europe, which in my understanding is a serious, if not threat, but a serious challenge to the West as a whole. I'll stop here.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was very important thoughts. So as we transition to conversation, I would eventually like to address the role of the U.S. here in its relationship with Hungary and democratic backsliding. But I first want to address the pandemic. And I'm personally really tired of hearing in these unprecedented times, from car commercials and everything. But history really has moved at warp speed this year. And I get in fights on Twitter with a lot of people who say, autocracies were better at handling the pandemic because they had more control over society. Can you two address kind of how Hungary has responded to this and kind of give them a report card?
Go ahead, Melissa.
I will say I haven't tracked what's happened with the pandemic, very closely on a regular basis in Hungary. But what I have seen is that there have been real gaps, and that what's happened is you see the Hungarian government trying to refocus the issue on, targeting gay people or targeting, migrants, or doing something else to draw attention away from the fact that people are not getting health care, that their hospitals are overwhelmed, and that there are problems with their ability to take care of their own people. And so there have been real gaps. There have been, I guess I wouldn't say protests as in out in the streets, but there's been a lot of attention called by opposition, but also just regular people saying that they're not being taken care of. And the Hungarian government's response has been to say, look over there, look at what's going on over there.
I think Hungary is doing terribly. So maybe I think in a sad and sarcastic way, the fact that a Hungarian dictatorship is not able to deal with this properly is a message that no, dictatorships don't deal with this more properly. And I would strongly disagree with the idea that you have to have a totalitarian system where you force people to report on each other, and where you have face recognition and you force this, you force that. That's the way to deal with it. So this is the I think this is the bottom line. The second thing is, yes, one of the reasons Hungary is doing so badly is because Orban dismantled the healthcare system. It's never been very good, but it's been okay. Hungary had a pretty good healthcare system. Now it's a disaster. And three, the reason why he is still getting away with it is because he controls the media. He controls the information. And many do believe the BS that's coming from state institutions. However, Hungarians, and I looked at the latest statistics, Hungarians do not want to take the Russian shot that's coming into the Hungary. Hungary is the only EU country that has started negotiations with the Russians to buy their shots, which means that Hungarians are not totally stupid. They don't trust the Russians. They don't like this idea that we're moving towards the Russians. So I think the picture in Hungary is mixed. And I don't nobody what it has made, and this is a side comment. The pandemic has made the situation worse because it has basically introduced the idea of ruling by decree, and not because of the pandemic, but under the veil of the pandemic. Viktor Orban has introduced a number of laws which we will regret, and which is only aimed at cementing his power. So that is how I connect the situation, the backsliding of democracy with the pandemic. And definitely in Hungary, this is not just a health issue like it is in most Western European countries.
Great. I would like to remind our audience, if you have questions, to please type them in at the Q&A box in the bottom. Let's go to one question from former Idaho Congressman Larry LaRocco. And he said, how has America First foreign policy impacted our relationship with Hungary? And I find that America First in the context of foreign policy to be kind of oxymoronic, because it, of course, has to deal with other countries as well. Any comments?
I'm okay. I'm going to be very cynical here. In a way, I'm an America First guy when I say we need American leadership in the world. There's just one family. There's one Western family. In that family, there is only one leader, and that's the United States. So in this sense, yes, America First. But not in the sense that America can isolate itself in the world and should not care about others. It is not America First that it should fight with the European Union, its closest allies, to the extent that we don't care how we damage this. So I'd say that the idea of America First, in the sense that we don't give a damn about how this hurts our allies, that's wrong. So America, this concept of America First is wrong. It's been damaging, and it is time that the United States is. I've heard someone say this, that America is back, and it's time that America is back. and America needs to lead. And on that, I'm very, very stubborn, and I'm ready to argue with my European friends when they say no, it's a relationship of equals. No, America has to lead, but lead in a good way.
Melissa, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. I will say that for me, having worked in a number of foreign countries, that the US leadership is about values, that people abroad look to the US for those values of rule of law, human rights, and that's the America first that I think that's the leadership that people look to us for. And when the US has not projected those values and essentially seemed to say that what Viktor Orban is doing, but not only Viktor Orban, other dictators, that their policies are okay, that has had a real negative impact, not only in Hungary, but I think across the world. We've seen a lot of negative impacts for democracy in various countries. But I think that there's been a real change in Hungary, and that has been a signal within the EU that we've started to see some real harm within the EU and NATO. So I agree with Ambassador Shimone. I hope America is back. I'm hoping.
Yeah, great. So I think that deals a lot with the way in which the United States has exported its system around the world, to the chagrin of some folks and to the welcome arms of others. I have a question here from Monica Church. She's a government teacher locally in Boise, and Senator Frank Church's granddaughter, actually. And she says, what is China's role in all of this? Melissa mentioned the university that they're building in Budapest, but is China successfully exporting the authoritarian model?
Melissa, should I go first?
Go for it.
Okay. So I think it's first of all, thank you, Senator, and thank you, Monica, for asking this question. I think first I should have said this. Without Russia, without China, the Hungarian model, the Hungarian experiment would not work. So to be very clear, without strong Russian involvement in Hungary, without the efforts by Putin and the openness of Viktor Orban to import the Putinesque ideas, and without China also exporting its own institutions to Hungary, the Hungarian model would not work. And this, of course, includes first and foremost corruption. The Russians are doing this in a brutal way. The Chinese are doing it in a much more sophisticated way. Well, they had 4,000 years to refine the way they work, but nevertheless they aren't less dangerous. And one thing you must keep in mind, and this goes back to my the question, why should the United States worry about little Hungary? Well, because Hungary has been singled out as the Trojan horse for the Russians and the Chinese inside NATO and the European Union, and Viktor Orban, unfortunately, is happily playing along with the Chinese and the Russians. So, Monica, this is why establishing institutions in Hungary, and I could name a list of institutions that the Russians have established in Hungary, like, for example, a Russian bank of construction and investment in construction, which the employees of which have diplomatic immunity in a NATO country. What a ridiculous thing to do! I mean, it's totally unheard of. But this has gone basically, I don't think it's gone unnoticed by the US and the EU. They just didn't care about it. But I think the Chinese, and don't forget the The Chinese are desperately trying to find pillars for their One Belt, One Road project. And I really think Hungary has been singled out as one. There are a number of examples when there are Chinese investments which are totally unnecessary and not needed for Hungary's future, which are going on and which only serves the long-term interests of China and maybe Russia.
Melissa?
Yeah, I will say I agree. It's about the money. Hungary is one of the largest recipients of EU funds. So if Hungary is going to, say no to EU funds or mess with the EU, it needs cover. And so it gets that cover from Russia and from China. The Chinese are funding this railway between Hungary and Serbia. I mentioned a number of Russian Russian funded projects. And it's also, I think, about you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. In addition to the International Investment Bank, Hungary had a golden visa program that it doesn't have now, but it is continually rethinking and considering reopening. And that golden visa program allowed a number of Chinese nefarious figures to get visas within the EU. And same with Russians, Russians that were working with Syrian, with Syrian dictators, and basically those that were on the sanctions list for the U.S. are getting visas within the EU because Hungary is letting them. And so I think the corruption is going both ways.
Let me just add something, and this is not totally related to the Chinese-Russian issue, but I'd like to say that in many ways, the European Union has made things worse in two ways in the last 10 years. One, they put the Hungarian democracy's immune system was put to sleep because they suggested that the so-called Copenhagen criteria, which basically is the criteria of democracy, is going to be checked. And it was not checked. And so let's face it, Hungarians were always pointing to Brussels and saying, oh, well, we don't have to worry about this because at the end of the day, the European Union is going to step in. Well, they did not step in. And two, I'm not a great fan of the German auto industry. When it comes to the choice between profits and values, German industry, well, guess what German industry will choose? And the fact is that Hungary is basically an assembly line for German industry, and the position of the German industry towards Angela Merkel was always, don't rock the boat. This is great. We're doing fine, and just don't do it. The rest is, of course, it's complicated, it's sophisticated, the European People's Party and this and that. But at the bottom, the bottom line is that basically German industry is perfectly okay with having a situation like this in Hungary. So I just wanted to add this because the issue we're struggling with today at the European Union and the whole debate about the distribution of money and Hungary and Poland blocking this is of the EU's own making. Be very, very careful not to just to say, oh, it's because this nasty Viktor Orban. No, it's the EU's own making. They allowed the situation to deteriorate to the extent that now it's almost impossible to control without major, major damage to the European Union itself.
I've got a great question here from fellow board member Peter Finn, and it deals with one of my favorite international organizations. So he writes, when some of us worked with the National Democratic Institute in the early 90s in Hungary, Fidesz was an idealistic youth element that everyone had high hopes for. They were the party that most rejected communist rule and authoritarian tendencies. What chance do you see for a resurgence of ideals, and what can the US and European nations do to encourage that?
This book I wrote, this book I wrote,
Mhm.
it's really not just about rock and roll. It's about the American idea. I wouldn't have written it if I did not believe that the great American idea is still there. So it starts with resurrecting the great American idea. So that's where it starts. I do believe that I don't think those ideals are dead. But they have definitely been suppressed. So don't get desperate. I think the ideals are still there, and I would even argue that the majority of Hungarians would rather like to see those ideas be dominant again. They just don't know. They just don't know how to do it. I'd also want to say that it's interesting. It's interesting. You mentioned this, Richard. I remember a conversation, and this is crazy because I had a conversation with Madeleine Albright 15 years ago. Madeleine was at that time. Madeleine Albright was at that time I think she was the chairperson of the National Democratic Institute, and Madeleine, suddenly said to me, "My greatest disappointment in life is Viktor Orban." And that was 15 years ago. And we were nowhere even close to what we have today. It was 5 years before Viktor Orban came back to power. And I just want to say that we knew, the really sad part is we knew where this is going. And so if you want, my sadness is really because we kind of knew what was coming and we did very little. So, but I certainly don't want to blame it on NDI and IRI, because many conversations I had with both institutions, they were trying their best to tell politicians, hey, wait a minute, you've got to do something about it. And so I just wanted to mention this, but thank you for the question. No, the American idea, the idea of America, the ideal of democracy and freedom is certainly not dead.
And I would echo that, because look, like Fidesz in the last presidential election, they barely got 50% of the vote. So, they had to work hard, even with all their resources, all the media, all the campaign finance, they barely got 50%. And then when you look at the municipal elections in 2019, you had 10 opposition mayors gain power in municipalities. And so that's, again, without the resources. You had the opposition finally learning that they had to unite in order to gain ground, and they did. And I'm sure, with consultations with folks like NDI and IRI, like with them learning how to build coalitions and how to run campaigns, because they don't have the resources that Fidesz has. And so, you asked also, what can the US do, or how can the US be supportive? The US has reintroduced Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty of Euro in Hungary. And I hope that will get some financing and really be able to grow, because without any independent media, it's really tough out there. So, that's one thing that the US has started, that it should continue. There are some carrots and there are some sticks. The US did introduce a $700,000 aid program for independent media couple of years ago, and then the Orban government said, we don't like that idea, and the US pulled it back. And so we should not do that. We should actually try to support independent media in Hungary. And then in terms of sticks, I would suggest going after the corruption in Hungary, and again, saying that is not okay, by, for example, using the Global Magnitsky Law to identify individuals, István Tiborcs, who has been, identified by the EU as using a lot of EU funds for his personal projects. He is the son-in-law of Orban, but could be, put on the list. There are other examples as well, just to send a message that we're looking at corruption, and, we're going to be taking action. So be aware, be warned.
So Chase, since I can see we're approaching the end of this
Yeah.
conversation, I just like to, first of all, really good and interesting thoughts from Melissa. Thank you. And I also agree. At the core of all this is corruption. It's money, and so that's maybe that's a separate conversation. But I do believe that that's an important comment. But I don't. There are two things I'd like to say. First of all, Hungarians now understand that they should not expect anyone from the outside to solve their problems. This is a Hungarian issue. So it's not George Soros. Even if Orban would love to paint the idea that anything that happens on the opposition side is George Soros. Well, first of all, in full disclosure, there are a lot of things where I really think that Soros made dumb comments and made mistakes and made things worse. So let's leave Soros behind. And also, just yesterday he made a comment. I think he should stop. He should stop talking about this. He should step aside, because that's not the point. The point is what we do expect from what Hungarians, not we. I live in the United States. I have a totally different vantage point. But I do think Hungarians expect is the West, the United States and Europe to help create a level playing field. That's all they are asking. Help us create a level playing field where we have access to the media, we have access to resources, and when the time comes, they cannot use their concentration of power to kill us. That's really what I think we need to keep in mind. And then the last thought, I want to make sure, I don't think we should be obsessed. Viktor Orban loves the idea that the world is obsessed with him. I'm not obsessed with Viktor Orban. I think the guy is very smart. I think he's both very strategic and tactical. He's outsmarted all these smart politicians in Western Europe. It's crazy. But, Edward Teller invented the atomic bomb, and it was a Hungarian who invented the whole concept on which the Pfizer vaccine is now created. Don't forget that. Very smart. So, it's just a very smart Hungarian outsmarting the world. But this also means that I don't believe, and this is something, this is really tricky, and I know many won't agree with me, but I do believe that as much as the Third Reich was really linked to Hitler, I do believe that this situation in Hungary is linked totally to Viktor Orban. It's the rule of one person with a lot of supporters, but it's about honestly, it hinges on Viktor Orban. And I'm the last one to build a cult of personality, but I would suggest that think about this. Anyway, this is a great conversation, and I love the idea, Melissa. It's so good to work with you. I mean, you and I have had a lot of good conversations. And Chase, thank you very much. Thank you really very much. I mean, I'm not the one who should wrap it up, but I will have to leave soon.
Yeah, we are approaching the end of our hour, and we want to respect our panelists' time. Melissa, do you have any really quick closing thoughts?
I will just echo, what we have spoken about. The EU has lagged, and the EU has not been responsive, and so now you see this oversized Hungarian monster that is impacting what's happening in the EU, and I think beyond the EU. And the US has contributed by accepting Orban and even in some ways embracing him. So I hope that we can see some changes there. And we can get some support to democratic institutions and democratic thinkers within Hungary from the international community, because we need to do something. We need to make some changes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you very much to Melissa and Ambassador Simonyi for joining us this morning for an excellent discussion. I would like to give special thanks to Scott Cullinane at the US-Europe Alliance for setting up our panel. We want to encourage everyone to check out their program offerings at useurope.org. And please tune in to our keynote address in about 1 hour's time. We will hear from Larry Diamond of Stanford University. He's the author of Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. These sessions will be recorded and posted to Frank Church Institute's social media pages. We encourage everyone to share those videos and keep the conversation going. And if you have enjoyed this programming, we encourage you to consider a contribution to the Frank Church Institute so we can continue to offer programs like this in the future. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning, and have a good day.